Today is the 61st anniversary of the enactment of Medicare and Medicaid under Lyndon Baines Johnson in 1965, July 30th, 1965. He signed that piece of the Social Security Act, which was passed in 1935, into law. And so we are on the 61st anniversary of Medicare and Medicaid, the two original health programs for the American people. And I wanted to tell you just a little bit about that because it matters. And the what I mean by it matters is obviously it matters to people, but the ideology behind creating Medicare and Medicaid is the one that the people who are currently in charge of the Republican Party and thus of the country are trying to change to a different ideology. So it's kind of worth thinking about. The idea of health care provided by the government for people actually comes all the way back from Theodore Roosevelt at the turn of the 1900s into that century. And that was kind of a non starter in the progressive era. It didn't go very far. But after World War II in 1945, President Harry Truman called for a universal system of healthcare in the United States. And that really made sense coming out of World War II and coming out of the Depression. One of the things that pushes the idea of the Social Security Act of 1935 and of the programs that the Democrats embrace during the Depression before World War II is actually inspired by a movement to protect the elderly who really in the Depression are really hard hit because, of course, without Social Security, without the sorts of programs like Medicare and Medicaid that we have now, the elderly didn't have places to live and they didn't, it was hard to move home with your kids if or to work to live with your kids simply because you were another mouth to feed. And so there's actually a guy named Francis Townsend. He's a doctor who's in California, and he looks out of his window and he sees two elderly women eating out of a trash can. And he says, we have to do better than this. And he starts a movement to try and ameliorate the conditions of the elderly in during the Depression. And he actually is not the person who ends up getting into power to do something, but that idea that the country has to do something to make sure that you don't have elderly people living on the street is one of the real pushes for the New Deal. So after World War II, Truman, who takes over after Franklin Delano Roosevelt dies on April 12th, 45, he calls for a healthcare program for the elderly. And he really can't get it going anywhere for a number of reasons, but it really doesn't take off, although that impulse is certainly there. And it is LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, who is able to put Medicare and Medicaid into place July 30th, 1965. And so it's sort of a historic day. And the reason that I gave you that whole wind up with the history of Medicare and Medicaid is because most of your questions today were about the news reports that the Trump administration is trying to get rid of Medicaid. And Medicare was the original system that helped the elderly, and Medicaid was the original system that helped people who were living in a certain level of poverty. But one of the key pieces today, when you think about that difference between Medicare and Medicaid, is that Medicaid generally is the support for assisted living and nursing homes and the kinds of things like wheelchairs, the kinds of thing, the apparatus that the elderly need. Now, not always, but that's sort of when people talk about cutting Medicaid and they think about it just being about poverty, it's actually often the subsidies that make it possible for people to be in a nursing home, for example. So what's going on with Medicare and Medicaid and the Trump administration? And it's really confusing because there's a big story right now that dropped on Tuesday in the Wall Street Journal that is getting blown up and conflated with two other stories. And a lot of people are confused about it. So what happened was that on Tuesday in the Wall Street Journal, a reporter named Anna Wild Matthews reported that the Trump administration is ending at the end of this year a program started under former President Joe Biden that provided subsidies to the purchasing of prescription drugs under Medicare Part D. That's the prescription drug part of Medicare. And the trick to those subsidies was that they provided money directly to insurers to keep premiums low for for people on Medicare Part D. And they also, Biden administration also capped the annual amount of money that somebody under Medicare had to put toward prescription drugs. At the time, it was 2000. It's gone up since then, for cost of living stuff. And they also allowed the government to negotiate with drug companies for prices. And the Republicans really, really, really hated that. Although, by the way, it is we are the only developed country, and most not developed countries either, that doesn't permit the government to negotiate in some fashion or to cap the price of drugs in their country. I've written a ton about this. If you're interested, just look at my name and Google drug subsidies, or Google. I haven't done it, so I'm guessing the words Medicaid probably. Although I write about Medicaid a lot, so that you may get more than you want. I did this back during the Biden administration. I explained this stuff in real detail. Anyway, the Trump administration wants to get rid of those subsidies for the Medicare Part D drug purchasing that has kept those costs down. And they are doing so because they are complaining that the government subsidies go directly to the insurers, the health insurers, and that's their argument for not doing it, is they're going to their people and saying, hey, the government's just paying insurers and you don't want us to do that. But Mehmet Oz, who is the administrator for the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, says that the government intends to is stabilizing the market so this bailout is no longer needed. And they claim that this will actually lower the costs of prescription medication for people who are on Medicare Part D. Those people who are looking at it, though, who are not part of the government, actually don't think that that's going to be the case for most people. And they do point out that because of some of the details I'm not going to go into right now, that this may push people into Medicare Advantage, which is the private insurer version of Medicare. And that is something that the Republicans have wanted for a long time, is to get rid of Medicare and push people toward a private system in which the government contracts with a private insurer to provide services to the elderly. And again, I've written a ton about that as well, and you can Google that. So that's the story that's in the news. These subsidies are going to end, at least they say that. I'm going to suggest you can push back on that. Are going to end at the end of 2026, and the administration maintains that this will make care cheaper and better. I don't trust anything they say. So it's up to you. You can trust it. I have my grave doubts about that. Anyway, that's one of the stories. And that's the story that broke on Tuesday, and that now you're seeing stories all the time. He's going after Medicare. He's going after Medicaid. The specifics today, as of Tuesday, are just about the end of those subsidies to Medicare Part D. But that's getting rolled into other stories that we should be paying attention to. The first of those is that the Trump administration has stopped payments to Medicaid payments to California and Minnesota. Lots of them, insisting that Medicaid payments to those states have been fraudulent. And I've written a lot about that they are, that's Medicaid, by the way, not Medicare. There is something called an error rate in the way that they analyze payments in Medicaid. And that error rate is associated with people using the wrong code in paperwork. So it's not at all clear. This is not individual fraud as much as it is just the paperwork, basically, is what people who study this stuff say. I don't study this myself. I just read what other people say. But they are pretty clearly trying to trying to punish California and Minnesota. For some reason, Trump just has a total bee in his bonnet about Minnesota, probably because Tim Walz is there and Tim Walz called him weird. And also, he really loathes, with a capital L, Gavin Newsom, whom he clearly sees as top candidate for the Democratic nomination in 2028 and is trying to cut him off at the ankles. So that story is also there. Trump is trying to establish the precedent of simply saying to states, we're not going to fund your Medicaid. So good luck, because you're engaging in fraud. And somebody asked me a couple of weeks ago, can they do that? And one of the very rare times in which the federal government can do that, although they have been doing stuff like that under Trump, completely illegally to my mind. But the one of the few times you can withhold payments, federal payments for Medicaid, is under suspicion of fraud. So they're very deliberately using that. So there's that story out there as well. But then the really big story that is getting conflated into that story from Tuesday is the bigger story, and that is that, if you remember, the July 4th, 2025 One Big Beautiful Bill Act, the bill that the law that the Republicans pushed through Congress without any Democratic votes under something called budget reconciliation. I'm listening to this and I'm thinking, this is so in the weeds, and I understand why people lose track of it, because, like, literally, this is what I study. And I'm like, okay, here's this lane, here's this lane, here's this lane. And I'm sorry about that. I'm trying to make it as clear as I can. Um, but the weeds kind of matter, because having passed the One Big Beautiful Bill Act under budget reconciliation can't be filibustered. So what it means is that they could slam this through without any Democratic support. And they did, and they gave us this One Big Beautiful Bill Act. And it was essentially the Republican wish list forever and ever. It essentially screwed over anything Democrats wanted and just gave the Republicans what they wanted. And in that One Big Beautiful Bill Act of July 4th, 2025, a little bit more than a year ago, there were cuts of about $1 trillion to Medicare and Medicaid. I'm sorry, to Medicaid, not to Medicare, to Medicaid, over 10 years. So you can see the tearing back of money from Medicaid, especially, which, as I say, they focus on that as being about poverty. It's also about elder care. And those three stories wrapped together are why you're seeing politicians, especially Democratic politicians, going, they're coming after your Medicare and your Medicaid, and people getting really confused and thinking that they're going to lose Medicare. And the truth is, there's three separate stories: Medicare Part D, end of subsidies; clawing back of Medicaid to Minnesota and California; and major cuts to Medicaid over 10 years because of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. So that's what's all going on there. But the reason I wanted to set it up there, and you guys are probably all like, I'm out of here. I'm going to go for a run because I can't take any more of this stuff. And I would not blame you for that. Um, the reason I wanted to set it up the way I did is because Truman, and by the way, when LBJ signed the Medicare and Medicaid measure into law, he gave the first Medicaid card to Truman to say, you're really the father of this program. Anyway, that idea that the government should help people, should create, safety nets, should make it possible for the elderly not to have to worry about their health care, should extend people's lives. That theory is the one that the Republican Party in its current incarnation is doing their best to tear apart, because they disagree with that. They don't think the government should do that. They think the government should concentrate wealth among a really small group of people, with the idea that individual investors will be able to make better decisions about how to invest in the economy than the government can with its regulations and so on. So that you want the efficiency of private markets, But at the same time, that sort of ballooned into the idea that some people should rule over other people. And you've got Donald Trump now using the government to funnel contracts and to use taxpayer money to benefit himself and his cronies. And you're seeing here in the struggle over things like Medicare Part D, the pushback on the idea that the government should help individuals and help people survive as a community, things like that President Biden really threw himself behind. And instead, you're really seeing this administration double down on this different ideology that what the government really needs to do is it needs to focus on enabling individual men for the most part, to be able to do whatever they want, sort of give them their all the leads you want so that they can all the lead they want so that they can create these successful businesses and they can do things in really successful ways. And that what you really want to do is not bog these great minds, these great men down with the problems of the community.